Friedrich Nietzsche stood at the pivotal crossroads of the most profound transformation in Western history. He not only foresaw the origins and outcomes of this upheaval, but also put forth a grand, revolutionary body of thought for an age mired in confusion, striving to guide humanity out of its spiritual predicament. He ranks among the most significant and influential thinkers in the entire history of modern thought. In Nietzsche's era, the Christian faith that Western society had clung to for centuries was collapsing at its core. As the foundations of faith crumbled, people were left with a profound spiritual void in the face of life, death, and suffering. It seemed as if the only paths ahead were to sink into pessimism or drown in the abyss of nihilism. Nietzsche spent his entire life confronting this defining crisis of his time, seeking to forge a wholly new way forward, one that rejected blind adherence to outdated religious dogma, refused to drift aimlessly with the tide of nihilism, and instead enabled humanity to rediscover the meaning of life and define its own inherent values. Nietzsche was born in 1844 in the Saxony region of Prussia, now part of Eastern Germany. He came from a humble, ordinary family and had a quiet, stable childhood, raised in the loving care of his family. His father, Carl Ludwig Nietzsche, was a local Lutheran pastor, so Nietzsche was immersed in the Christian faith from an early age, surrounded by teachings of God and devotion. This faith took root in his heart almost instinctively. Yet this faith, planted in his childhood, was shattered by reality long before he reached adulthood. His father, who had taught him to believe in God and lived by that faith every day, was suddenly diagnosed with a terminal brain illness. For an entire year, his father suffered unbearable agony and finally passed away in the prime of his life at just 35. To make matters worse, Nietzsche's younger brother Ludwig died in early childhood the year after their father's death. On one side was the religious faith he had believed in since childhood, which promised that good deeds would be rewarded and that God would protect the righteous. On the other was the unbearable sight of his kind, innocent family members suffering unmerited, irreversible pain. This stark contrast left an indelible mark on Nietzsche's heart. It was this very contradiction that sowed the first seeds of his later philosophical thinking and became the core intellectual wellspring of all his subsequent works. After enduring a gloomy, somber, and profoundly lonely childhood, Nietzsche enrolled at the University of Bonn, initially studying theology. From his early schooling to his university years, he displayed extraordinary intellectual talent and a sharp mind. He excelled in all his studies, particularly in Christian theology, and was regarded as a star student by those around him. Yet no one could have foreseen that his thinking would undergo a complete transformation after just one semester at Bonn. As his thinking grew increasingly critical and his perspective more incisive, and as he was exposed to a wave of ideas that questioned and critiqued Christianity, Nietzsche made the painful decision to abandon his Christian faith entirely. He was no longer the young boy with blind religious devotion. He shed his youthful naivety and began to see the world through his own eyes, unshackled by rigid dogma. He then transferred to the University of Leipzig to study philology and linguistic history, where his academic abilities advanced by leaps and bounds. In his mid-20s, he was appointed Professor of Classical Philology at the University of Basel, becoming the youngest professor in the institution's history, a record that still stands to this day. Yet Nietzsche resigned from this coveted academic position after only a few years. For one thing, he grew increasingly frustrated with the rigid rules and conventions of academia, which stifled his free thinking and expression, leaving him feeling trapped. For another, his health deteriorated steadily, a result of both genetic factors and, as is widely believed, syphilis he contracted in a brothel in his early years. After leaving academia, Nietzsche lived a life of near seclusion. He traveled across Europe, moving from place to place in search of climates that suited his ailing health, surviving on a meager pension from the university. The Swiss Alps were where he spent the longest time, a home that came to define his later life. Most of his remaining lucid years were spent amid the mountains and valleys of the Alps. Those years in the Alps were an ordeal for Nietzsche. He was frequently bedridden by a host of illnesses, endured a devastatingly painful love affair that ended in heartbreak, and gradually drifted apart from family and friends, his relationships with them growing increasingly distant. He even sank into a deep depression and nihilism from which he could barely escape. Yet even in the depths of this suffering, he devoted most of his time to walking, thinking, and writing. For him, philosophical inquiry was his only spiritual anchor. It brought him solace in his misery and gave him the meaning and courage to keep living. It was during this lonely, suffering period that Nietzsche wrote his most famous and influential works. Human, all too human, the gay science, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, and On the Genealogy of Morals, all of which would go on to become classics of philosophical history. In these works, Nietzsche laid a solid foundation and completed the initial construction of an entirely new philosophical system. This philosophy fundamentally shook all the accepted certainties of his time, shattering people's ingrained notions of good and evil, and even completely overturning the age-old traditional standards for judging truth and falsehood, right and wrong. One of Nietzsche's most famous and powerful quotes is still recited by countless people to this day. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we not ourselves become gods simply to appear worthy of it? Many people mistakenly believe that when Nietzsche declared God is dead, he was celebrating humanity's liberation from the shackles of religion. But this could not be further from the truth. What we feel acutely in this statement is his profound anxiety about this reality and his solemn warning to humanity. In Nietzsche's view, the collapse of Christian faith meant the collapse of everything built upon it. The entire moral system of Europe, its underlying logical core, and its fundamental value orientation, all were left without a foundation. He foresaw this long before it happened and feared it deeply. If humanity suddenly found itself without faith and with no other spiritual anchor to turn to, people would be left adrift and struggling. Without clear moral standards, without knowing the meaning of life, society as a whole would eventually be engulfed in despair, and everyone would fall into nihilism. To address this core crisis of his age, Nietzsche put forth many pivotal ideas. One of the most important is his unwavering belief that there is no such thing as universal, objective truth in the world. He once wrote, "There are no facts, only interpretations." In his eyes, the so-called absolute truth is itself a false concept. All the efforts humanity expends in the pursuit of absolute truth are nothing but a misguided path. This, he argued, is the root cause of modern humanity's spiritual loneliness, alienation, and loss of meaning in life. People are so fixated on the pursuit of universal objectivity or on finding a meaning of life that transcends physical existence that they detach their spirits from the lived experience of the present moment. Yet in reality, our immediate life experiences are inherently subjective, unique, and demand authentic expression. This is what is most vivid and real about being human. It was for this reason that Nietzsche turned his intellectual focus to the humanities and the arts. He firmly believed that creative acts and experiences, whether in music, philosophy, literature, or theatre, could help us convey the deeper truths of human existence. They could fill the spiritual void in people's hearts, forge deep spiritual connections, and allow humanity to rediscover the meaning of life. Yet, in his exploration, Nietzsche also identified a flaw. The humanities and arts are not omnipotent. They easily become rigid, over-academized, and even commodified. In the end, these once warm forms of art and culture lose their original luster and value, and can no longer serve as humanity's spiritual anchor. Having recognized this problem, Nietzsche turned his gaze in a new direction. He sought to build a wholly new philosophy, one whose core principle was freeing the individual from dependence on collective experience and cultural systems. It urged people to stop blindly following the crowd, to break free from the constraints of rigid cultural frameworks, and instead to focus on their own creativity, express their true selves, and strive for their own unique excellence. In simple terms, it meant giving every person the power to construct their own meaning of life and live as they truly wish to live. The most central expression of this philosophical vision is the concept of the Übermensch, Overman, that Nietzsche first introduced in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Nietzsche's Overman is not a fantastical figure with superhuman powers, as we might imagine, but a person of unyielding spirit, unshakable self-confidence, and complete spiritual independence. They strive tirelessly for their own ideals, hold fast to their beliefs, and never apologize for their true thoughts. They dare to stand apart from the crowd, refusing to drift with the tide. They act with deliberate purpose, practice rational self-interest, and move through the world with resolve and extraordinary dignity. In Nietzsche's view, these qualities were not arbitrary. They were what humanity most needed in his age. For the people of that time required a new moral system to replace the traditional Christian morality, a morality that glorified weakness and humility as virtues, and which was utterly incompatible with humanity's true nature. Humanity's inherent state of being is filled with a longing for vitality, strength, and excellence, and a new morality must align with this most authentic human desire. Naturally, Nietzsche's ideas have faced legitimate questioning, and many have misinterpreted and taken his words out of context. But in truth, far more important than the specific image of the Overman that Nietzsche painted is the profound meaning behind the concept. From a broader perspective, Nietzsche's Overman is none other than the most ideal version of ourselves that each of us holds in our hearts. It is the perfect, powerful self that has overcome all fear, mended all flaws, and realized its full potential. We can set this ideal self as our life's goal and strive our whole lives to draw closer to it. Of course, as an ideal state, we can never truly become the Overman, but that is precisely the value of the concept. It pushes us forward, urging us to keep growing, always. Alongside the Overman, Nietzsche put forth another core concept, the will to power, which stands as a cornerstone of his entire philosophical system. He argued that the entire world, including humanity itself, operates according to the will to power. Every living being, from the moment of its birth, has an irrepressible drive to express its strength and to become more powerful. He once stated, "The world is the will to power, and nothing besides." And many people see the word power and assume Nietzsche is talking about physical strength or the domination and control of others. But this is a complete misunderstanding. In Nietzsche's eyes, the will to power is nothing more than humanity's innate drive for personal growth. This will is truly fulfilled when we strive step by step toward our growth goals and become better versions of ourselves little by little. The power he speaks of is never directed outward at others. It is directed inward at the self. It is the power to master one's own life, to constantly transcend one's own limits, and to cultivate an inner spiritual strength. For Nietzsche, mastering one's own life and walking the path of constant growth is the state that aligns most perfectly with the will to power. It is in this state that we truly become one with life itself and feel the authentic joy of being alive. And setting the Overman as our goal, this longing and this pursuit, becomes an endless source of motivation for our self-growth. Throughout our lives, we are constantly dissatisfied with ourselves, seeking ways to improve, and then rediscovering ourselves in the process of growth, a cycle that never ends. Nietzsche called this process self-overcoming, and it is the key to answering life's ultimate questions. What is the meaning of life? And where is the value of human existence? As long as we set our hearts on the life-affirming, perfect version of ourselves and strive to grow toward that ideal, all the suffering we endure in the process of self-overcoming will be transformed into something valuable. Those difficult days will become the nourishment for our growth, and in this process, we achieve our own self-redemption. This is a spiritual transcendence that allows us to face the inevitable sufferings of life with courage and to retain our love for life even in the darkest of times. Nietzsche has another deeply moving quote that captures the very essence of life. He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. When it comes to the question of suffering, Nietzsche's views stand in stark contrast to those of his predecessor, Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer believed that the sufferings of life should be minimized and avoided as much as possible, that this was the greatest kindness one could show to oneself. But Nietzsche thought differently. He believed that suffering need not be avoided. Instead, it is something we must face and embrace. For suffering is never merely a bad thing. It builds our strength, tempers our minds, and becomes the most precious nourishment for our growth. Nietzsche always maintained that life itself is an inescapable experience of suffering. We need not wonder whether we will face suffering, for it is inevitable. What we should instead ask ourselves is, for what purpose do we endure this suffering? He once wrote, "The curse that has lain upon humanity hitherto is not suffering itself, but the meaninglessness of suffering." To put it simply, what is terrifying is not the pain itself, but suffering without purpose. It is this meaningless suffering that brings the deepest despair. Nietzsche lived in his solitary alpine home, continuing to write and explore the philosophical questions that consumed his mind. But as he pushed forward with these ambitious intellectual pursuits, his mental state deteriorated steadily, showing clear signs of decline. At the age of 44, an event occurred that changed his life forever and triggered his mental breakdown. He was walking down the street one day when he saw a horse being brutally whipped by its owner. His heart broke and he suffered an immediate mental collapse. He rushed forward, threw his arms around the horse and stroked it gently, murmuring over and over, "I understand you, I understand you." No one could have foreseen that this strange, poignant moment would be his last period of lucid sanity. This act of profound compassion, softness, and empathy seemed to stand in complete contradiction to his own philosophical teachings, and it has left countless later generations feeling a deep sense of sorrow. After that day, Nietzsche sank into complete madness. His mental state grew worse and worse until he finally fell into a catatonic state, losing all consciousness and all response to the outside world. This brilliant mind, one of the most powerful in modern history, seemed to have been ultimately crushed by the weight of its own thinking. What exactly caused this tragic decline? Was it an organic brain disorder, a lingering after-effect of his earlier illnesses, or was it his relentless thinking, his extreme introspection, that led him into a labyrinth of thought from which he could never escape? To this day, no one knows for certain. It remains an unsolved tragedy. In 1900, Nietzsche died of a stroke at the age of just 55. He never regained his sanity, never returned to his philosophical work until his last breath. If we judge Nietzsche's life by his own standards, it might be deemed a failure. Before he lost his sanity, he seemed to accomplish nothing extraordinary, to live a life of obscurity. His books went unread and unsold. He never received any significant recognition or respect, and he lived most of his life in loneliness and illness, unknown to the world. Yet no one could have foreseen that after his death, his ideas would suddenly erupt with immense power, like a seed buried underground, finally sprouting and growing into a towering tree. His works began to attract attention from people all over the world. His philosophical ideas were admired and followed by countless individuals, becoming a force that shaped the entire world. Unfortunately, in this process, some of his ideas were deliberately misinterpreted and even abused by those with ulterior motives, leading to terrible consequences, something Nietzsche could never have imagined in his lifetime. Even so, to this day, Nietzsche's works remain full of vital force, and his ideas are deeply woven into the fabric of modern thought, an indispensable part of it. His famous quotes, his pithy sayings, and his philosophical visions can be seen everywhere in contemporary culture, both literally and symbolically, shaping the thinking of generation after generation. This is a deeply ironic coincidence, for as Nietzsche himself once said, a person must undergo countless symbolic deaths in life, breaking the chains that bind them to truly become who they are. To pursue something more noble, more valuable, we sometimes have to sacrifice ourselves, to give up a life of comfort, even to surrender our health and sanity. Nietzsche's life and his death are the perfect embodiment of this truth. In his pursuit of higher philosophical truth, he walked the path of self-overcoming all the way to self-sacrifice, living his entire life in faithful practice of his own philosophy. Naturally, Nietzsche's ideas are not perfect, and they are not accepted by everyone. His concepts of self-overcoming, sacrifice, and the pursuit of excellence in particular have faced many legitimate criticisms. While he saw the problems of modern society with remarkable clarity and predicted the nature of humanity with extraordinary insight, the solutions he proposed are not all practical, nor are they suitable for every person. People ask, is it truly worth struggling through a lifetime of suffering and constantly exhausting oneself in the pursuit of an unattainable goal? If someone fundamentally disagrees with this idea, how can they find meaning in such a life? Furthermore, if a person inherently sees life as negative and meaningless, how can they ever construct a life-affirming interpretation of existence? In other words, if a person truly feels that life is empty and meaningless, even if we force goals upon them and make them live according to Nietzsche's ideas, they will ultimately end up right where they started. For they will desperately crave a truth or meaning that transcends their own perception and experience. And such a thing simply does not exist. What is more, if someone does not believe from the very start in the core idea that suffering is worthwhile for the sake of progress, then Nietzsche's other theories will be meaningless to them, even a misleading distraction from what is truly important. We must understand that Nietzsche was always a maverick philosopher. His books were never written with a linear logic or a rigid, systematic structure. At times, his ideas even seem to contradict themselves. It is precisely this quality that makes his thought open to countless interpretations. What we have explored here is merely one superficial understanding, a small door into the vast world of Nietzsche's philosophy. And this is the greatest treasure of Nietzsche's philosophy. It is never a set of rigid answers for us to follow, never a lesson in how to think conformally. Instead, it is a lighthouse that illuminates our path and teaches us to think for ourselves. Even if we do not agree with his ideas, it does not matter. For Nietzsche has left us ample space to be like him, to refuse to drift with the tide, to reject blind obedience to authority, and to forge a life path that is truly our own. This is perhaps Nietzsche's most precious gift to humanity.